I'm Jack, and I'm an intern based at Forest Research and the University of St Andrews. And today I'm going to be presenting on perceptions of elm loss and restoration. So this is part of a wider interdisciplinary project looking at the social acceptability of lost tree species restoration. So this is supported by an amazing team across Forest Research, the University of St Andrews and Kew Gardens, of course, Ritha, who is in the same room as me today, so thank you for that. This project uses 3 case studies chosen for their different relationships with elm. The Wye Valley, the centre of my case study, was chosen in part because of its large-scale historic loss of elm and other tree species, as well as high forest cover, large forestry sector, and a long-standing cultural connection to trees, as well as numerous ongoing restoration projects and some locally significant tree species that own, with the apple orchards and the native black poplar shown on the slide there as really good examples. So this project set out to look at land manager perspectives, but from early engagement, this expanded to encompass a wider range of stakeholders as we saw that there's more people involved. The objectives of this project were to explore perceptions of tree species loss and its impacts, and to identify motivations, challenges, and opportunities for restoration. So this was achieved by conducting 14 in-depth semi-structured interviews, both online and during fieldwork in the Wye Valley this January, with interviews subject to preliminary analysis, which I'm going to be presenting on today to give you a bit of a snapshot of the project. So who did we speak with? So as part of engaging with wider stakeholders beyond traditional conceptions of land management, we spoke with some amazing individuals, from those involved in decision-making, those who actively manage trees and engage in research, and those involved in harvesting and the use of wood, such as sawmillers and woodworkers. So we had just about over 50% of our participants from a productive land use background there. So what do we mean by loss? So it's important here to note that perspectives of loss, it's not the same as local extinction, but rather what individuals consider loss means to them. This tends to cut across biological, functional, cultural, and social forms as the basis of our project. So elm, obviously, is our main case study, species that we set out to speak with participants about, with them describing different relationships between wych elm and English elm here. So wych elm, more small-scale relationship, and it's less visibly present in the landscape and confined to woodlands. And English elm and field elm, more recent loss experienced through Dutch elm disease and its impact on the farming landscape. Beyond elm, participants identified a range of species, with native black poplar and the heritage orchard varieties really key areas of local concern, as well as the ongoing loss of ash, larch, and the potential future loss of oak as well, a real concern. So quite a high level of awareness around tree species loss in our participants. So how did our participants describe loss? So they described themes of change. I think that change is really key. So they described changing landscapes. So obviously you've got that loss of hedgerow trees and that classic elm landscape, which people really drove home. One of our participants quoted Orwell, who described it as a magical elm landscape, a magical elm forest. And this is being replaced with dead trees, standing sentinel, and now a complete absence from the landscape. I think that's a really quite otherworldly photo there. We've got changing relationships, sorry. This is past, present, and future. And I think an elm chair is a really lovely example of shifting use, something that used to be fairly common and is now sort of a rarity, with sort of hopes for revival for the future. And in terms of changing memory, we've got intergeneral changes in memory and ownership and recognition. So how people see trees is very different, and if you haven't seen it, it's hard to conjure up what you're lost, really. So in terms of the impacts of loss, so stakeholders identified economic, ecological, and sociocultural impacts derived from these changes. It's important that we note that these aren't siloed, and they do cut across different groups, but for ease of communication, we've sort of categorized them a little bit. So in terms of economic, you have both the cost of managing and then the resource itself as well. So for example, the cost of managing loss, with one participant stating that local councils were having to fell healthy ash, as well as because it's just more cost effective, as well as sawmills saying that importing elm from Scotland and further abroad is just not it's just unsustainable and expensive. In terms of ecological loss, species reliant on elms, such as the white-letter hairstreak there, as well as hundreds of other dependent species, has had a massive impact on their habitat. And in terms of sociocultural impact, we've got a decline in presence and everyday use. I think the tools there and also kids around the tree, it's just that fading recognition, leading to shifting baseline and eventually cultural amnesia. So in terms of motivations and restoration outcomes, these aligned broadly around functionality, biological diversity, aesthetics, and cultural value. Also important to note that these aren't exclusive, and they do cut across each other as well. So in terms of functionality, we've got uses for elm. So we've got the beautiful waning edge cladding there, as well as timber framing. So this like practical purpose and practical use is a real driver for restoration and what people want to see as successful restoration. In terms of biological diversity, so supporting those native species, the white-letter hairstreak comes back again, as well as all of the other dependent species. So really providing that habitat and connectivity across the landscape as is associated with the elm hedgerows. In terms of aesthetics, you've got that classic figure of eight shape and the classic elm landscape shown on an image a couple of slides ago. And in terms of cultural history, we've got that sociocultural connection to elm. So in different uses, you've got the pilot gig boats, you've got from Cornwall, you've got green woodworking, so and its everyday use in bowls, tools, and it's just our presence in our day-to-day lives. And that's what people really want to see. I think people want to experience it. And it's important that we note here that restoration, it's not static, it's not a return to the past, but it's very much forward-looking and evolving, and people want to sort of see that in the future. So we found that challenges break down into organizational challenges, so that's around sustaining long-term effort. And we found that quite often the restoration efforts depend on like one or two linchpin individuals. So it's really about supporting them and creating broader networks through knowledge sharing and community development. In terms of financial challenges, we need to meet the size of the restoration challenge with the right financial resources, joining up projects and extending them to create more long-term forward-thinking restoration networks. In terms of public attitudes, so this, I think a lot comes down to building trust between land managers, policymakers, and researchers, so the guidance is seen to address the wider needs of these communities and what they're asking, as well as sort of making it clear that there's no invested interest. That was a real concern, as well as addressing different cultural differences currently preventing restoration between different groups. So really building community is really key there. In terms of management challenges, these involve managing our woodlands more actively to reduce browsing pressure from deer and squirrels, with one participant stating that, in fact, deer is the largest threat to elm and ash's continued presence in our woodlands, not disease. So that's a really key issue. And it's also important that we utilise the technology where available. So in terms of opportunity for the restoration of lost trees, there's plenty of opportunity with stakeholders being interested and really enthusiastic about elm restoration, and pretty much willing to put the effort in, even if they're not being logistically supported currently, showing that, in fact, it's not a lack of interest or enthusiasm, but it's generally a lack of means that's stifling current restoration efforts. Alongside this, there's a high level of awareness around the need to future-proof woodlands and the UK's timber industry, especially concerning climate change resilience. And I think it's really cool that elm was seen as being potentially useful for this, especially in terms of agroforestry, promoting wooden diversity, as well as acting as framework for other species in the for restoring other species in the future. So overall, this project has given us a snapshot of stakeholder perceptions of tree species loss and restoration, with this cutting across species, time and space. There's an interest and a willingness to invest in restoring elm and other locally significant tree species, such as the native black poplar. And despite there being logistical challenges at current, there is the innovative spirit and the willpower to achieve this restoration. And I think this is a really lovely quote that we can end on, that, there's a lot of future for elms if we can, if we can make them viable again and if we meet the needs of the restoration challenge. So yeah, I'd like to say thank you for listening, and I'd like to thank everybody that we've engaged with during fieldwork. I'd like to thank the referrer as well for her help during this project. Yeah, thank you all for listening. Cheers.